Pokémon Z was real. Not in a fan theory kind of way, not a leak from some random Twitter account. I mean actual, verifiable development work from Game Freak, complete with internal project logs, playable builds, and design documents. And then they deleted it. Not shelved for later, not delayed, erased, overwritten like it never happened. And here's the wild part. For over a decade, the community has argued about whether Pokémon Z was ever anything more than wishful thinking. People dug through X and Y's code, found odd placeholders, but never enough to call it proof. Until now. What I'm about to walk you through isn't just evidence. It's the full autopsy of Pokémon Z. How it started, what was in it, the bizarre concepts Game Freak was toying with, and why it vanished in just over a month. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what we lost and how much of it was quietly recycled into future games without anyone noticing. But to make sense of why Pokémon Z even existed in the first place, we need to talk about one of Game Freak's most consistent, almost mechanical habits. Something they quietly did for generations that made upper versions like Emerald and Platinum possible. And the moment I explain the system, the breadcrumbs leading to Pokémon Z are going to make perfect sense. Up until Generation 8, Game Freak had a habit that was almost like future-proofing their games. Whenever they made a new mainline Pokémon title, they didn't just code the game they were releasing. They built in hooks for an upgraded version they hadn't even announced yet. These upper versions were enhanced editions that reused the original game's world, but added new story beats, mechanics, and post-game content. Think about it. Ruby and Sapphire got Emerald, Diamond and Pearl got Platinum, Black and White got full sequels. This pattern was so ingrained that it became an unspoken rule of Pokémon's development cycle. And the hints weren't just in marketing, they were buried right in the game's code. Ruby and Sapphire had placeholder data for Emerald. Diamond and Pearl's internal order literally listed Platinum before even listing Diamond or Pearl themselves. Black and White had code space for their sequels from the very start. So when Pokémon X and Y were being developed, it wasn't a question of if there'd be an upgraded version. It was when. And sure enough, hidden deep inside the game's data, there were 4 mysterious entries labeled Kalos Reserve 1 through 4. These weren't for DLC. They were preloaded slots Game Freak could later use to build and release future titles without having to re-engineer the base framework from scratch. 2 of those reserves would later become Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. The other 2? They stayed blank. For years, fans speculated about them, assuming they might have been placeholders for a Pokémon Z or other unreleased Kalos follow-ups, but there was never any confirmation. Until we found the smoking gun. On April 15th, 2013, months before Pokémon X and Y even hit store shelves, Game Freak did something that, in hindsight, basically confirmed our suspicions. They went into the internal code, took Kalos Reserve 1, and renamed it Version Z. That wasn't a fan nickname. That was the actual project name inside Game Freak's own development environment. From that moment, Version Z wasn't just a placeholder. It was a real project with a code name, Upper Fake. See, internally, Game Freak called their enhanced editions upper versions. Emerald was an upper of Ruby Sapphire. Platinum was an upper of Diamond/Pearl. And in their internal logs, Pokémon Z was the upper version of X and Y, hence Upper Fake. And that's when the work started. Now, here's the part that makes this whole thing almost tragic, because Game Freak didn't just toy with the idea. They branched it off from the main X and Y development, started pulling in assets, and began actively experimenting with new content. This wasn't a someday project. It was happening. The development window we can see lasted just over a month, from mid-April to May 21st, 2013. And on that final day, the project flatlined. Version Z was wiped, the Kalos Reserve 1 slot was overwritten, and what came next would completely bury Z's existence for years. But before we talk about its erasure, you need to see what was inside that last build, because even in its rough, incomplete state, It hints at the version of Kalos we never got to explore. And some of the ideas in there, they were unlike anything Game Freak had done before. And here's the kicker. While this might sound like the start of some vague lost media story, the Pokémon Z build from May 21st still exists. It's not complete, it's rough, but it's enough to prove that this game was more than just a codename in a database. It was a playable, tangible project. And once you see what was in it, you're going to wonder the same thing I did. Why on earth did they kill it so quickly? That's where we're going next, inside the Pokémon Z build itself. The weird title screen, the strange experimental mechanics, and the bizarre mega evolutions that feel like Game Freak was testing something they didn't want anyone to know about. But remember, this was 2013, right before Pokémon X and Y's release. Kalos was brand new. Mega Evolution was the hot new mechanic, and Pokémon Z could have been the game that tied it all together, if only it survived past spring. If you really want to understand why Pokémon Z even existed, and why its deletion is so strange, you have to look at how Game Freak thinks about their game releases. Because for years, they didn't just make a game, they made the first game in a planned set. The Pokémon community has a nickname for these enhanced follow-ups, third versions. But inside Game Freak, they had their own term, upper versions. These weren't expansions or DLC. They were full retail games built on the framework of an existing generation, with new features layered in. And this wasn't some rare marketing stunt. For over a decade, it was practically policy. Think about it. Ruby and Sapphire got Emerald, which refined the Hoenn story and gave Rayquaza a starring role. Diamond and Pearl got Platinum, with Giratina front and center. Black and White didn't just get an upper version. They got full sequels. It was almost like Game Freak was saying, here's the base game, and here's the definitive version you'll want a couple years later. Now here's the clever part. They didn't start from scratch for those upgrades. They preloaded the groundwork into the original game's code. When you bought Ruby or Sapphire, Emerald's DNA was already in there, dormant, waiting. The same with Diamond and Pearl. Platinum was hiding in the code before anyone knew its name. They did this for efficiency. Instead of rebuilding all their systems and assets when they wanted to release the upper version, they could just activate the reserve slot, branch the project, and start adding the new stuff. And the hints were always there for people who knew where to look. Ruby and Sapphire had placeholder entries for Emerald. Diamond and Pearl didn't just leave room for Platinum. They actually listed it ahead of themselves internally. Black and White included entries for a second set of titles before the sequels were even announced. For data miners and fans digging through game files, these placeholders became smoking guns. Which brings us to Generation 6, Pokémon X and Y. During development, Game Freak did the same thing they've been doing for years. Buried deep in the game's data were 4 mysterious internal listings: Kalos Reserve 1, 2, 3, and 4. No official explanation, no obvious purpose. But for anyone who'd studied past patterns, the meaning was clear. These were the upper version slots for Kalos, and whatever remakes or spin-offs Game Freak had planned for Generation 6. When X and Y launched, fans combed through the files. They found those Kalos reserves. They speculated endlessly. Some guessed Reserve 1 would be Pokémon Z, Reserve 2 another Kalos game, and Reserves 3 and 4 could be remakes of older titles. But it was all guesswork, until someone noticed a change in the development logs. On April 15th, 2013, months before Pokémon X and Y were released to the public, Game Freak made a very deliberate edit. They took Kalos Reserve 1 and renamed it Version Z. This wasn't a fan term. This wasn't a nickname. This was the actual internal label inside Game Freak's development system. It was also the exact moment that the project officially began. From that day on, Kalos Reserve 1 wasn't just an empty slot. It was Pokémon Z. And the codename? Upper Fake. Now that sounds weird until you remember the naming system. Inside Game Freak, the upper label was shorthand for enhanced editions like Emerald, Platinum, or Black 2 and White 2. So Upper Fake meant the upper version of Pokémon X and Y, with fake being a stand-in word. possibly to mask the project's real identity in certain tools or test builds. Once they flipped that switch, the branching process began. This is where they took the base X/Y code, split it off into its own project, and started pulling in every major asset they'd need. The logs from that period tell the story clearly. X and Y were basically finished. The main team was in the home stretch toward release. Meanwhile, a smaller group, only a handful of developers, started poking at the new branch, testing ideas, and laying the groundwork for what Pokémon Z would be. And then it all happened fast. From April 15th to May 21st, 2013, Pokémon Z was alive in active development. That's just over a month, barely enough time to set up a project, much less finish anything playable. But even in that short time, they managed to make some changes that would later become smoking gun evidence that this wasn't just a label in a database. Because we've seen that final build, the one from May 21st, 2013, the day the project was killed. What's so strange is how Game Freak killed it. When they decided Pokémon Z was done for, they didn't just shelve it and leave the slot open. They went into the database, erased the version Z label, and replaced Kalos Reserve 1 with Alpha Sapphire. They even overwrote Reserve 2 with Omega Ruby. And here's where it gets even more bizarre. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire weren't supposed to be in Reserves 1 and 2 at all. Those had been set aside for something else entirely. Oris was meant for Reserves 3 and 4, but instead of using those, they just bulldozed right over Pokémon Z's data. It's like they weren't just canceling it. They were making sure nothing of it survived. Reserves 3 and 4? They're still sitting there untouched to this day. Little ghost slots from an abandoned plan. But 1 and 2? Completely replaced by Oras. Which means that when the Pokémon Z branch was killed, all the assets, all the code, everything that had been started in that month-long window was overwritten into oblivion. Almost, because that May 21st build still exists. And if you boot it up, you see something that proves without a doubt that Pokémon Z wasn't just a plan. It was a thing. And it was weird. That's what we're getting into next. The last surviving version of Pokémon Z. The bizarre title screen, the experimental mechanics, and the early ideas that might have been testing grounds for features we wouldn't actually see until years later. And once you see what they were playing with, you'll understand why some fans still say canceling it was one of the biggest missed opportunities in Pokémon history. When Pokémon Z branched off from X and Y's code in April 2013, it wasn't some massive full team shift. Game Freak was in crunch mode, finishing their first fully 3D mainline titles, and they had a lot riding on that simultaneous worldwide launch in October. So Pokémon Z started small, a splinter project with just a handful of developers assigned. Their job wasn't to reinvent the wheel overnight. It was to lay the foundation, pull in assets, start testing ideas, get the framework ready so that once X and Y shipped, the team could pivot into full production on the upper version. And for a few weeks, that's exactly what happened. The May 21st, 2013 build, the last surviving version of Pokémon Z before the axe fell, tells us a lot about how far they got and just how strange their experiments were. The first thing you see is the title screen, and immediately it's clear this is not some fan hack or mock-up. The logo? It's Pokémon X's, but upside down. And underneath, it's playing the FMV cutscene from Pokémon Y, no Z logo, no polished intro, just a weird mismatched placeholder that practically screams work in progress. Boot past that, and for the most part, you're looking at the core X/Y content. Same story beats, same Kalos region, same Pokémon roster. But remember, this was only 2 months before X and Y's release. The main game was basically complete, so of course it looked the same. The differences are buried deeper, and that's where it gets interesting. Buried in this build are a couple of oddities that don't match anything in the retail versions of X and Y. Things that suggest the developers were testing mechanics and forms that either got scrapped completely or got reworked years later in entirely different games. The first, and probably most bizarre, is Mega Bulbasaur and Mega Charmander. Yes, you read that right. Not Mega Venusaur, not Mega Charizard. Bulbasaur and Charmander, the unevolved base forms, had their own Mega Evolution entries coded in. If you gave Charmander a piece of charcoal in battle, you could trigger its Mega Evolution. The model wasn't finished, just a floating purple Charmander sprite used as a placeholder. Bulbasaur's was equally bare bones, with a force change revealing a test form. Now, realistically, did Game Freak ever intend for these to be real, final features? Probably not. It's much more likely these were test cases. When you're building a new form system like Mega Evolution, you need throwaway entries to debug the mechanics, and base forms are convenient for that. But here's where the speculation kicks in. If they were experimenting with Mega Evolutions on any Pokémon, it means they weren't limiting themselves to fully evolved ones. Technically, Mega Evolutions are just temporary alternate forms. There's no rule that says they can't apply to base stages, which opens the door to the idea that Pokémon Z could have experimented with a wider range of form changes. And that ties neatly into another theory, the bond phenomenon. If you've seen the anime's Ash Greninja storyline, you know the gist. A special transformation triggered by a strong connection between a trainer and their Pokémon. In the games, it barely exists. Sun and Moon toyed with it for Greninja, and that was it. But imagine a whole game exploring that mechanic, with multiple Pokémon capable of bond forms. Given the presence of these odd Mega Bulbasaur, Charmander forms in Z's build, it's not crazy to think the devs were playing with transformation concepts that went beyond the standard Mega rules. And if that was the case, Pokémon Z might have been the perfect place to debut the bond mechanic years before it hit the anime, or Sun Moon. The build also shows some subtle visual tweaks. For example, the player character sprites are slightly different from the retail versions. Small enough changes that most players wouldn't notice, but enough to confirm the branch had unique asset edits. Even weirder, the default team assigned to the developer's save file included a shiny Vileplume. Why? No clue. It could have been for testing shiny encounter odds, or maybe a placeholder for event Pokémon distributions. Either way, it's another sign this was an active dev environment, not just a copy-paste of the retail build. And then, that's it. No new story events, no post-game expansion, no new areas. Because on May 21st, 2013, Pokémon Z's development came to a dead stop. The internal record shows that on that day, Game Freak wiped the version ZAD label from Kalos Reserve 1. They replaced it not with a blank, but with Alpha Sapphire. Reserve 2, which might have been Z's companion slot for a parallel project, was replaced with Omega Ruby. It's worth emphasizing how unusual this is. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were never meant to take those slots. They were intended for Reserves 3 and 4, but instead of leaving 1 and 2 intact, Game Freak deliberately overwrote them, essentially bulldozing Pokémon Z's branch out of existence. Reserves 3 and 4, untouched to this day, but 1 and 2, the Z slots, gone. The build we have is only intact because it was archived separately before the overwrite happened. Without it, Pokémon Z would be nothing more than an entry in an old changelog. And that makes the May 21st build one of the most fascinating, what could have been, artifacts in Pokémon history. Because if it had survived, even in its placeholder state, it might have evolved into one of the most ambitious upper versions Game Freak ever made. And that's exactly where we're heading next. Because while the build itself is bare bones, the design documents tied to it are not. And those documents spell out in detail what Pokémon Z was supposed to be. The new mechanics, the focus on Zygarde, the completely original form concepts that never made it into X and Y, and only some of which were recycled in Sun and Moon. And once you see the Zygarde plan, you'll realize Pokémon Z wouldn't have been just XY with a bonus legendary. It would have been the true heart of Generation 6. If the May 21st build of Pokémon Z gave us a glimpse of how far development had gotten, the design documents show us how far it was supposed to go. And at the center of it all? Zygarde. The Sun and Moon development archives include multiple references to Pokémon Z. Not as a rumor, not as a concept, but as a fully scoped project. In fact, one document outright calls Zygarde the main Pokémon of the upper version of Korra, with Korra being the internal codename for Pokémon X and Y. The plan was clear. Zygarde would be to Pokémon Z what Rayquaza was to Emerald or Giratina was to Platinum. The cover legendary, the narrative glue tying the region's mythology together, and the centerpiece of new mechanics. But they weren't just going to give Zygarde a flashy new form and call it a day. They were building an entire game mechanic around it. This is where the Colony Pokémon project comes in. The documents describe Zygarde not as a single creature, but as a being composed of countless small Pokémon called individuals. On their own, these individuals are weak, but when they unite, they form a legendary entity capable of maintaining the balance of the Kalos region. Sound familiar? That's because years later, Sun and Moon would introduce Zygarde cells and cores, the collect and combine mechanic where you gather pieces scattered across Alola to assemble different forms. But in Pokémon Z, this concept would have been the core of the game's story. The swarm feature, as the docs call it, was exclusive to Pokémon Z. It wouldn't exist in base X and Y. The idea was simple but powerful. You'd roam Kalos, tracking down these individual Zygarde units. As you found more, Zygarde would transform, unlocking new abilities and forms, each tailored to counter one of the other legendaries in the region. And that's another key point. Zygarde's role in the plot wasn't passive. It wasn't just a hidden legendary waiting in a cave. The lore positioned it as the neutral force between Xerneas and Yveltal, just like Rayquaza was the peacemaker between Kyogre and Groudon. The documents are explicit. When the balance of life energy in Kalos is disrupted, Zygarde appears to fight whichever force is tipping the scales. In Z's storyline, that meant direct confrontation with Pokémon X and Pokémon Y. The form system they planned was surprisingly complex. The base Zygarde from X and Y, what we now call the 50% form, was referred to as the Z form. In the story, it had already released half of its individuals into Kalos, retreating into nests to act as a sort of hive mind. This Z form would serve as the command center, collecting data from the individuals you encountered throughout your journey. But the real stars were the two upper version exclusive forms. VSX form, designed specifically to counter Xerneas, described as a feline or wolf-like beast, a natural deer hunter. It played directly into Xerneas' stag-like design. VSY form, built to counter Yveltal. More humanoid in shape, it hunted using what the doc calls anti-aircraft gun-like techniques. That's an unusually aggressive image for a Pokémon form, and it suggests a much more combat-oriented depiction than we usually see. Both of these forms were considered the complete entity of Zygarde, capable of using 100% of its power. The implication is that your progress in the colony mechanic would lead you to unlock one form or the other, depending on which legendary you were up against. And there's more. The doc mentions 3 special monitor forms scattered across Kalos. These wouldn't participate in battle, but would appear during certain scenes, possibly as a way of tracking your progress. They sound suspiciously similar to the Zygarde cores that appeared in Sun and Moon, but here they might have been more integrated into the main plot. The whole thing reads like Game Freak was gearing up for a much more dynamic legendary story than what we got in X and Y. Instead of just showing up in a cave post-game, Zygarde would have been the focal point of the narrative, with the player actively building it up over the course of their journey. And here's where it gets even wilder. The forms we know from Sun and Moon, they don't quite match the original descriptions. The VSX form, with its wolf-like traits, does sound kind of like the later 10% form Zygarde, but the scale feels off. The document clearly pitches it as a full power form, not a partial, which suggests that the 10% form we got was a scaled-down remnant of this original concept. The VSY form, on the other hand, lines up much closer to what became the 100% form in Sun and Moon. Humanoid body, heavy combat focus, overwhelming power. In other words, when Pokémon Z died, half of its designs were shrunk down, and the other half was carried forward more or less intact. The last page of the document even hints at additional forms, saying Zygarde's body shape could change greatly, depending on how its individuals connected, which opens the door to the idea that Pokémon Z could have had multiple situational forms beyond the main ones, something we've never fully seen realized. And just to make this sting a little more, the dev notes explicitly say that all of this would have been exclusive to the upper version. X and Y players wouldn't get these forms or the colony mechanic. If you wanted the full Zygarde experience, you'd have had to play Pokémon Z. It's hard not to see the missed potential here. Kalos was already criticized for having a shallow postgame, and Z could have fixed that overnight. The colony mechanic would have given players a reason to comb every route and city. The expanded lore would have deepened the legendary conflict, and the new forms could have given Zygarde a place in the pantheon alongside Rayquaza and Giratina. Instead, the entire system was mothballed, and a couple years later, it was dusted off and repurposed for Sun and Moon. There, it became a side quest in Alola instead of the central storyline in Kalos. And that's the thing. Once you know what Pokémon Z was supposed to be, you can see its fingerprints all over Generation 7. Zygarde cells, straight from the Colony Project, 10% and 100% forms, lifted from the VSX/VSY concept. Even the neutral Peacemaker role was recycled, just not in the game it was meant for. But that's not all Pokémon Z had in the works. The design docs only cover the legendary and its mechanic. Other internal pitches from the same month hint at additional features and even whole new areas in Kalos that never saw the light of day. And that's exactly what we're covering next. The side concepts that were being pitched during Pokémon Z's short life, including one surprisingly ambitious minigame that was probably meant to be a breakout feature. By mid-May 2013, Pokémon Z had only been alive for about a month in active development. But that didn't stop Game Freak from throwing around big, bold ideas. Some of these concepts feel small and quirky. Others could have fundamentally changed how we remember Kalos. And the clearest window into those ideas is a strange little pitch dated May 14, 2013, just a week before Pokémon Z's death sentence. If you've played X and Y, you might remember the brief Rhyhorn riding segment early in the game. It's essentially a one-off scene, a few bumpy animations, and then it's gone. Cute, but forgettable. But in this pitch, Rhyhorn riding wasn't just a one-time tutorial moment. It was going to be a full-fledged Rhyhorn Racing feature, with a dedicated course, competitive elements, and possibly even multiplayer. The 4-page internal presentation lays it out almost like a Mario Kart meets Pokémon hybrid. Different tracks across Kalos, time trials, obstacles that change based on terrain type, and of course, customization. Choosing which Rhyhorn you wanted to ride, each with slight stat differences for speed, handling, and jump distance. It wasn't just a what-if idea either. The timing makes it obvious. This was pitched during Pokémon Z's development window, when Game Freak would have been looking for new side content to make the upper version stand out. And here's why the timing matters so much. By May 2013, Pokémon X and Y were basically locked down. The main team was deep in bug fixing, localization, and final polish for their global October launch. They didn't have room to be pitching massive new gameplay features for X and Y itself. There was simply no time to implement them. But Pokémon Z, that was a blank slate, branching off from the XY code, but still early enough to slot in big ideas for future development. The Rhyhorn Racing pitch lines up perfectly with that timeline. It makes sense as a feature designed specifically to be part of Z's content roster. Had the project not been canceled a week later, we might have seen more of these expansion pitches get greenlit. And that's not the only side content idea tied to Pokémon Z. One recurring speculation among fans, and hinted at in developer conversations, was the introduction of South Kalos. Even before Pokémon Z was ever talked about, players had noticed something strange about X and Y's map. The bottom section of Kalos, the southern landmass, was visible in-game. even name-dropped in dialogue, but completely inaccessible. It was pure set dressing. That inaccessibility sparked years of rumors. Why include an entire named region if players could never visit it? For many, the logical answer was that it was being saved for an upper version. Just like how Black 2 and White 2 expanded Unova with new towns and routes. If Pokémon Z was meant to be Kalos' definitive version, then opening up South Kalos would have been the perfect way to make it feel fresh, while keeping the base region intact. We'll never know exactly how far those expansion talks went. There's no surviving map data or finalized concept art for South Kalos in the leaked materials. But there are just enough scraps to make it feel like more than fan fiction. One developer comment in a broader X/Y planning doc refers to unused settlement slots south of the main playable map. These aren't tied to any known towns in X and Y, which implies they were placeholders for potential future content. In Game Freak's planning language, that's often how they mark expansion areas that might appear in later games. Combine that with the Zygarde-centric storyline, and you start to see a potential narrative hook. South Kalos could have been where a large concentration of Zygarde's individuals were located, forcing the player to travel there mid-game to assemble its full form. Even smaller side features seem to point to Pokémon Z's ambition to flesh out Kalos' identity. That shiny Vileplume in the dev build's default team, it could have been related to an unreleased shiny hunting feature, a more guided way to track rare Pokémon, possibly tied into the colony mechanic. Think about it. If you're already scattering Zygarde's individuals across the map, you could use a similar system to seed other rare encounters. That way, exploration for Zygarde also feeds into a broader hunt for unique Pokémon. And then there's the matter of unused trainer sprite variants. The Pokémon Z build had slight differences in player character models, which some believe could have been early tests for expanded customization. X and Y introduced character customization for the first time in the series, but it was pretty limited. A second run at it in Z could have offered more hairstyles, clothing styles, and even seasonal outfits. Put all of this together, and you start to get a picture of what Pokémon Z might have looked like beyond its main legendary storyline. Expanded Kalos map, possibly including South Kalos. Colony mechanic at the heart of the game loop, tied to both story and exploration. Rhyhorn Racing as a full side mode, potentially multiplayer. More character customization options, integrated shiny/rare encounter tracking to make exploration more rewarding. It's not just a third version anymore. It's starting to sound like a near sequel, the kind of definitive Kalos experience that could have made Generation 6 one of the most beloved in the series. And then, it was gone. On May 21st, 2013, just 7 days after the Rhyhorn Racing pitch, Pokémon Z's project slot was overwritten with Alpha Sapphire. South Kalos remained inaccessible. The colony mechanic was mothballed, and the expansion concepts were scattered to the wind. Some of them survived in new homes. The Zygarde mechanic became a side quest in Sun and Moon. The customization options got expanded in later gens. Even Rhyhorn Racing, in a heavily simplified form, found its way into Pokémon X and Y as a tiny set piece. But the fully realized vision for Pokémon Z erased before it could leave the whiteboard stage. And that leaves us with the question that's been haunting this entire story. Why? Why cancel a project that was already slotted into the development cycle, already in motion, and already had unique features being pitched for it? The answer isn't in the files, but the timing, the priorities, and the context around Game Freak in 2013 might give us some clues. And that's exactly where we're going next. The likely reasons Pokémon Z was killed in just over a month, and how those reasons shape the future of the series. May 21st, 2013. Just over a month after Pokémon Z officially branched off from X and Y's code, it was gone, not paused, not, we'll revisit this later. Gone, wiped clean, and replaced with a completely different project. It's the speed of that decision that makes it so strange. Big game projects don't usually get greenlit and then obliterated in the span of 35 days. Not unless something massive changes. And while there's no single document that says, here's why we killed Pokémon Z, the context around Game Freak in 2013 paints a pretty clear picture of what might have happened. First, you have to remember where Game Freak was at that moment. They were finishing Pokémon X and Y, their first fully 3D mainline titles, their first global simultaneous release, and one of the most ambitious leaps the franchise had ever made technically. That switch to 3D wasn't just a visual change. It meant completely redoing animation systems, overworld rendering, battle scenes. Everything that had been built for the 2D handheld era had to be remade from scratch for the Nintendo 3DS. It was an unprecedented workload, and the clock was merciless. Global release meant that every localization team, Japanese, English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and more, had to get the final build at the same time, months before launch, so they could translate and debug without causing delays. That left almost no wiggle room for last-minute changes. So here's the reality. In April 2013, when Pokémon Z began, X and Y were in their final QA push. The dev team was split. The majority was still bug fixing, while a small group began seeding the Z branch. But if even minor issues started piling up in XY's final months, Game Freak would have had no choice but to reassign people. And by May, that's likely exactly what happened. The signs are everywhere. The Z build on May 21st is bare bones, with placeholder assets and almost no new content. That screams, side project losing manpower fast. The overwrite with Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby suggests a strategic pivot. If they needed an upper version style game, ORAS was a safer bet. It reused Gen 3's already completed map and story framework, which meant far less risk than building Z's entirely new content. 2013 was the first time Game Freak was also preparing to launch a major remake alongside a new generation on 3DS hardware. That's a huge resource drain. There's also the business side to consider. Pokémon Z would have been an exclusive for the 3DS, a single platform, but Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire could be marketed as both a nostalgic return for older fans and a modernized entry for new ones, all while requiring far less original asset creation. From a pure profit and effort standpoint, ORAS made more sense. They could deliver a polished, fan-pleasing remake without the same production risk that Pokémon Z carried, especially if XY's sales momentum wasn't as strong as they'd hoped. And that's another angle. Sales. Pokémon X and Y sold well, over 16 million copies. But they didn't dominate the way past generations had. Some of that was timing. Some of it was a 3DS install base, but it's possible the Pokémon Company looked at the numbers and decided an enhanced version might not move enough units to justify the workload. Then there's the internal politics of the Pokémon Company itself. Game Freak doesn't make release decisions in a vacuum. They work with Nintendo and Creatures Inc., and those three together decide the franchise's direction. If the higher-ups decided that the next big beat needed to be a nostalgic remake rather than a Kalos expansion, that call would override whatever the dev team wanted. And with the 20th anniversary of Pokémon looming in 2016, you can bet they were already thinking about how to pace their releases. ORAS in 2014, a break in 2015, and then Sun and Moon in 2016 made for a cleaner marketing pipeline than trying to wedge Pokémon Z into the middle. All of this makes the most likely scenario something like this. April 2013, Pokémon Z is greenlit as the upper version of X/Y, using Kalos Reserve 1 as its slot. A skeleton crew starts seeding assets and testing mechanics. May 2013, XY's final queue. A crunch eats into the Z team's time. Resources are pulled back to make sure the global release ships without disaster. Late May 2013, higher-level management decides to pivot the upper version slot to Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. Safer, less risky, more bankable. Pokémon Z is killed outright, its data overwritten, its features shelved for possible reuse later. 2014 to 2016, Z's mechanics resurface in Sun and Moon as side content, while Kalos remains untouched. becoming the only core region never to get an enhanced or sequel version. The result? 2015 becomes the first blank year for mainline Pokémon releases since the franchise began. No Z, no third version, no Kalos expansion. For a lot of fans, it cemented the feeling that Generation 6 was incomplete. And maybe that's why the myth of Pokémon Z lingered for so long. It wasn't just the missing game. It was the missing closure for Kalos. Players wanted the Emerald or Platinum moment that tied the region's story together. And instead, they got a clean break into Alola. The irony, of course, is that much of Pokémon Z did survive, just in pieces scattered across other titles. The Zygarde colony mechanic in Sun and Moon, the 10% and 100% forms, even some of the lore beats about being a neutral force between warring legendaries. But the game? The actual upper version of X/Y with its expanded map, its Rhyhorn Racing, its South Kalos, its full Zygarde storyline, that's gone. Not delayed, not maybe someday. Gone since May 21st, 2013. And yet, with the recent trend of Game Freak revisiting past regions in unexpected ways, like Pokémon Legends, Arceus, the door isn't fully closed. It's not impossible that Kalos could return in some form. And if it does, you can bet the ghosts of Pokémon Z's design docs will be in the room. But for now, Pokémon Z remains one of the rarest things in the series' history, a confirmed, documented, actively developed mainline title that no player outside the dev team ever got to finish. Which brings us to the end, the recap of everything Pokémon Z was supposed to be, and the lasting impact of its absence on the series. Because while the game itself was erased, the shadow it left over Generation 6 is still there. So here we are, more than a decade later, finally able to say with certainty, Pokémon Z was real. It wasn't a rumor, it wasn't fan fiction, it wasn't some data miner reading too much into placeholder entries. It was a living, breathing project inside Game Freak, with a codename, an active branch, design documents, and even a playable build. And yet, it never stood a chance. In just over a month, it went from a greenlit upper version of Pokémon X and Y, complete with its own storyline, mechanics, and side features, to being overwritten like it had never existed. In its place, a safer, more predictable remake, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. But because of how Game Freak works, Pokémon Z didn't vanish completely. Instead, its DNA was scattered, hidden inside other games, retooled for different generations, repackaged in ways that most players never realized. That Zygarde colony mechanic that showed up in Sun and Moon, born here. Those new Zygarde forms, directly adapted from the VSX and VSY concepts. Even the idea of tying a legendary to a map-wide scavenger hunt. That's pure Pokémon Z. But what we didn't get is just as important. We never saw South Kalos, the inaccessible southern landmass that was name-dropped but left untouched in X and Y. We never got the full legendary conflict between Xerneas, Yveltal, and Zygarde, the three-way dynamic that would have mirrored Rayquaza's role in Emerald or Giratina's in Platinum. We never raced Rhyhorn through a dedicated track, or experienced Kalos with the richer customization and expanded mechanics the upper version was supposed to deliver. Without Pokémon Z, Generation 6 became the only mainline generation in Pokémon history without a follow-up or enhanced version. No Emerald, no Platinum, no Black 2/White 2. Kalos started and ended in the same two games, and that's part of why the myth lasted so long. For years, people debated whether Pokémon Z was even planned. Some said Game Freak never intended to make it, pointing to the shift toward remakes and new regions. Others swore they remembered leaks, whispers, and hints that the project was real. Now we know the truth. It was real. It was in motion. And it was killed so fast that if not for the surviving May 21st build and those design documents, it might have been erased from history entirely. Which raises the question, could it ever come back? The cynical answer? Probably not in the form it was originally imagined. Pokémon Z was designed for the 3DS era, built on the specific architecture and limitations of X and Y. Rebuilding it now would mean remaking Kalos from scratch, something Game Freak is unlikely to do without a major reason. The more hopeful answer? Pieces of it could still live on. Pokémon Legends. Arceus showed that Game Freak is willing to revisit old regions in new formats. If they ever decide to give Kalos the Legends treatment, you can bet Zygarde would take center stage. And maybe, just maybe, some of those original colony mechanics and form concepts could resurface. But even if Pokémon Z never returns, its legacy is baked into the series. It's a cautionary tale about how quickly priorities can shift in game development. It's a reminder that the Pokémon Company's release strategy is as much about marketing cycles and anniversary dates as it is about creative vision. And it's proof that behind every generation we get to play, there are entire alternate timelines of games we never see. Pokémon Z is one of those timelines, and for Kalos fans, it will always be the great unfinished chapter, the missing link between what was and what could have been. So the next time someone says Pokémon Z never existed, you can tell them the truth. It existed. It had a story. It had mechanics. It had a plan. And on May 21st, 2013, it was erased. Not because it failed, but because something else was deemed more important. And maybe that's the most frustrating thing of all, that the definitive Kalos experience didn't die on its own merits. It never even got the chance to live. Generations come and go. Regions get revisited, mechanics get recycled, and legendaries get redesigned. But somewhere, in a buried branch of Game Freak's old development server, there's a project folder labeled Upper Fake. And in that folder is a version of Kalos we'll never get to see, the real Pokémon Z.